Hi, I'm Bill Morgan in the comm school here, and I'm here to introduce our next speaker. I'm delighted that he's here. This is Miller Brown. Miller graduated from Amherst College, spent a year in Paris as a Rotary Fellow. He received his PhD in philosophy from Harvard University, and he was Dean of the Faculty at Trinity from 1999 to 2004, and he's back in the philosophy department and said he's happy to be back there. So I'm not sure about that, but I'll take his word for it. His specific philosophical interests include the philosophy of science, the philosophy of medicine, philosophy of art, and of course the philosophy of sport. He's the past president of the International Association of the Philosophy of Sport, and in my opinion, one of the best scholars we have writing on enhancement issues. So without further ado, Miller Brown, the Bioethics and the Future of Sports. Miller.
Thank you all for coming. It's a great audience. I'm really pleased, and I'd like to thank Dan Durbin and especially Bill Morgan, Annenberg Center, for inviting me here. It's been a wonderful conference, and their generosity and very skillful organization has made this just a really delightful several days. And I thank my colleagues as well, whose earlier presentations have been wonderful, and I learned a lot from them. This paper is on the development of modern genetics and the possible influence this can have on athletics and sports. Of course, we don't know quite how that influence is going to work out. So I'm not making any predictions, but I'm trying to limn the field in ways that might illuminate some of the issues that will arise as genetic technologies become more developed and have an influence on the character of human life. I try to combine, therefore, two of my interests, the philosophy of sports and bioethics. Let me just say, as the orientation of the paper is this. I find myself in considerable sympathy with those people who advocate the use of biotechnologies to transform or change and enhance the genetic capacities of human beings. I will address some of the detractors from that view, some of whose views I find particularly loathing, but I generally find their objections implausible. However, even though I accept the ends of the enhancement project to some degree, I find the means by which that might be achieved to be fraught with some very serious dangers. So the central part of the paper is to investigate what kinds of constraints on the development of these technologies, particularly the clinical application of them, might put some brakes on the enhancement project in order to make its development safer and slower, giving us time to adjust to it and to understand what its implications may be. However, I don't think we can stop it. So let me begin. I have some sort of signposts along the way to help you understand how the paper develops. I'm going to start with the legacy of genetics and sports, a kind of background presentation, and then I'll go on to some other kinds of issues. Behind every sport is a story about genetics, not a story about the science of genetics or even a self-conscious awareness of the genetic basis of much that distinguishes athletes as it does the rest of us, but in the selection of players, in the rules of our games, and in the biases that sprinkle sports history. Genetics lurks as a hidden factor. Here I want to review the prospects for genetic enhancement and its impact on sports. Although I do not find the standard objections to enhancement of humans, whether athletes or not, to be persuasive, risks are posed by the means of achieving such enhancement, and efforts to reduce those risks may put an important brake on further developments. I will conclude with some reflections on sports and the changes likely to result from an enhancement project in the wider population. Our sports have always been segregated by the most significant genetic factor in human makeup, sex. Virtually all sports since ancient Greek games have been divided into those available to men and those available to women. With rare exceptions, this continues to be the case, though once in a while, of course, a male will try to slip into female competition and vice versa. But in most cases, in sports, we are almost two different species. And in other respects as well, our sports are segregated by phenotypes whose basis is clearly genetic. By virtue of their different rules and objectives, sports present challenges of very different kinds that favor athletes with very different physical and mental abilities that have at least a partial genetic basis. The history of sex verification goes back at least to the 1930s, when the International Olympic Committee began questioning the sexual identity of athletes. Routine sex tests were mandated by the committee in the 1990s, but discontinued after 1999. Individuals, however, are still being tested. But as our knowledge of the genetic basis of athletic abilities has increased, it has also generated much confusion and injustice. Because of the complexities of genetic variations and their effects on phenotypic traits, and because of the indignities of their use, the tests have been largely discontinued. But new rules and regulations by the IOC have done little to dampen the controversies, particularly in cases of hyperandrogenism, most recently in regard to the Indian sprinter whom you may have read about, Dutee Chand. There is, however, a fundamental difference between testing for genetic variation and testing for externally administered drugs such as steroids, growth hormone, or erythropoietin. Genetic variation is so far not something that can easily be created by the processes of contemporary biomedicine, though in the opinion of some, including myself, it is not long to come. As a result, sports authorities have great difficulty deciding what to do about naturally occurring variations in human traits and the processes that can affect athletic performance. They do promote muscle growth and reduce injuries, quiet muscle tremor, lower blood pressure. See if I skipped a page, I'm sorry. No, I did skip a page, I'm sorry. Let me pick up. As a result, sports authorities have great difficulty deciding what to do about naturally occurring variations in human traits that are beneficial to athletic performance. For example, natural variation in levels of hemoglobin gives some people advantages in endurance sports, such as cross-country skiing, where oxygen transport is crucial. Imagine a difficult case. Johan has autosomal dominant erythrocytosis that produces a statistically abnormal level of hemoglobin. This trait, together with rigorous training and the development of his skills, has enabled him to become a champion cross-country skier. Hans, however, has an average level of hemoglobin. He has found that by taking synthetic EPO, he can boost his hemoglobin level to at least that of Johan, and so can, if he trains hard, effectively compete with him. Should Johan be allowed to compete, but Hans be excluded because he has used a forbidden substance to enhance his performance? Or should Johan be banned because he is a genetic anomaly whose natural traits give him an unfair advantage? Recall that the naturally occurring variation in X and Y chromosomes, male, female, still forms the basis of banning athletes from some competitions. In other cases, we have chosen to ignore genetic-based variations in athletic ability, such as height, strength, agility, coordination, intelligence, just as we have largely ignored the advantages of class, race, education, wealth, coaching, equipment, and medical care for the development and enhancement of athletic ability. The controversies over the use of performance-enhancing drugs continues to rile our discussions of sports. But it is not often noticed that the drugs in question are, in a sense, only first-generation enhancers. They typically act by supplementing naturally occurring substances in the body in order to boost various biochemical processes that can affect athletic performance. They promote muscle growth and reduce injuries, quiet muscle tremor, lower blood pressure, and increase oxygen transport from lungs to muscles, and much more. Their types and effects are legion. The second generation will be drugs already available for medical treatments that directly trigger gene expression of proteins that will have similar effects on metabolic pathways and performance ranges. Third will be the genetic modification of somatic cells, body cells, already being developed for treating genetic diseases that are responsible for the same performance ranges. Possibly in this category will be the use of stem cells to enhance organ growth and metabolic functions. Fourth will be the modification of gametes, sperm, and ova, to provide for individuals who, from birth, possess enhanced biological endowments. Neither of these last two kinds of biomedical processes will be self-administered, and they will cloud the attribution of responsibility when they are chosen by others than those who will benefit from them. Anticipating such developments, a number of conservative commentators have railed at what they consider to be the dangers of enhanced athletes. These are the ones I particularly dislike. Michael Sandel, in his book, The Case Against Perfection, claims that enhancement efforts will promote a kind of hyper-agency, a Promethean aspiration to remake nature, including human nature, that threatens the integrity of the game. He deplores the emergence of bionic athletes. Leon Kass, chairman of the President's Council on Bioethics, made the startling claim that enhanced athletes are, quote, getting their achievements on the cheap, performing deeds that appear to be, but that are not in truth, wholly their own. Some of these expressions of concern are guided by an expectation that enhancement will be primarily for what is often called positional advantages. That is, for short-term advantages in competition that occur when some athletes, but not all, use enhancing techniques in competition and so gain a competitive or positional advantage. As many writers have pointed out, such advantage is not likely to last, since others will begin to use similar techniques and so rebalance the competitive scene. Thus, if parents hoping to have children who are successful in sports promote their children's height through genetic or other means, their goals will be frustrated as soon as other children are similarly enhanced. There's, of course, some plausibility to this concern, though it clearly applies to many different factors in competition, such as training techniques, food supplements, coaching, and equipment modifications, to name a few. There's always a tendency in competition to seek advantages that are soon countered by imitation or alternative approaches to the game. But not all such efforts at positional advantage are superficial or temporary. Many may have long-term benefits to the sport. They may enhance not only the player's competitive edge, but modify the sport in ways that increase the challenges and satisfactions that the sport provides. Furthermore, increasing the height, for example, of some people to make them more competitive may be a move to increased opportunity of participation by those who otherwise would fall short in the lottery of life. Techniques for achieving positional advantage may therefore, if widely shared, have the desirable effect of raising the level of ability of those who formerly were at a disadvantage, thus increasing the distribution of competitive abilities and so the opportunities for participation. But positional advantage is not the primary focus of critics of enhancement. They see athletes, perhaps rightly, as the most publicly visible exemplars of their worries about genetic change, and sports as the embodiment of their fears. Their concern rather is that such practices may undermine more generally in sports and elsewhere our sense of authenticity, of personal identity, and even our sense of what is natural to our species. And these objections, if sustained, would apply not only to enhancements aimed at positional advantages in sports, but also to so-called general purpose traits such as enhanced immune systems, cognitive abilities, memory, and emotional sensibilities, and a variety of physical changes in the patchwork of traits that characterize the legacy of natural selection. Some have even argued that the anti-enhancement efforts in sports is part of a more general war on enhancement that is motivated by the threat enhancement technologies pose to those whose power and wealth rest not just on hard work, but on considerable luck and natural talent, neither of which is deserved or evenly distributed by the lottery of life. Should enhancement become widely available, thus leveling the playing field in society in general and in sports in particular, the lucky would find their advantages, power, and wealth seriously challenged. Accordingly, the challenge of genetic and other techniques of biomedical enhancement for sports comes not from practices aimed at athletes only, but from the quite general goal of enhancing the human species. And while the rules of sports are for the most part arbitrary, sports reside within a larger social matrix where enhancement technologies are likely to proliferate, driven both by the private interests of individuals and families, the commercial interests, of pharmacogenetic enterprises and the concerns of governments to maintain productivity and military effectiveness. So what is the case for enhancement? Many of the arguments that are made against the prospects of human enhancement echo those that are made against enhancement in sports. Indeed, the same critics of enhancements often use sports to illustrate their concerns. Michael Sandel, for example, writes of bionic athletes. And although a so-called post-human future seems far off, we are already faced with a longer tradition of modifying human behavior with a pharmacopoeia of astonishing variety. Largely rising out of treatments for medical conditions, drugs are now available for enhancing human behavior and are used widely in the military, in schools, in sports, and in our daily lives. The drugs of choice on college campuses include Ritalin, Adderall, Prozac, Zoloft, Provigil, and other drugs, not to mention older standbys such as caffeine, antidepressants, synthetic hormones, and stimulants. Moreover, there is evidence that these substances usually work. They do indeed enhance the cognitive, physical, and psychological traits of people who use them, both those with diagnosed disabilities and those with more normal profiles. In sports, there's plenty of evidence that erythropoietin, human growth hormone, and many other drugs, including anabolic steroids, do effectively enhance athletic training and performance. We are probably witnessing the early stages of a large, unsupervised experiment in the pharmacological enhancement of human capacities. With the flourishing of stem cell research and the prospects for genetic manipulation of both somatic and germline cells in the human body to increase cognitive abilities, to improve our immune systems, to increase longevity, and to begin to remedy some of the worst results of our evolutionary history, we are indeed seeing the start of what may be profound changes in human life. There are risks that biomedical research in these areas pose, but there are also great benefits that they promise. It may be the case that failure to explore this research poses even greater risks to our future than does the research itself. We are in the very early stages of this enhancement project, so it is not too early to look at its prospects. Still, we are not there yet. And so we might use a phrase of Alan Buchanan to characterize this project. It is the ethics of science fiction. The trouble is, it's so sobering to note at the pace at which this fiction is becoming reality. So let me say very little bit about enhancement. Enhancements are generally considered to be improvements in normal human capacities or functions. We're especially aware of this in athletes. Some enhancement of our immune systems, some increase in longevity, various increases in the ranges of cognitive, emotional, and physical abilities seems to me very likely in the foreseeable future. On the other hand, immortality, uploading personalities into computers, the successful creation of cyborgs, and vast increases in cognitive and other abilities seems to be very, very far away. I want to consider now one of the main arguments that have been made by Michael Sandel and others against the enhancement project. And this is, roughly, that it is unnatural. The argument here is that tinkering with nature, a kind of sacrosanct given, would not only damage the order of the world, but would deny in us a respect and appreciation for the given in our lives, or as Sandel refers to it, the giftedness of features of human life. In sports, the concern is that the creation of what he calls bionic athletes would produce athletes whose achievements mock the strivings for excellence that characterize the challenge of sports. Athletes' accomplishments would no longer be due to arduous training and flinty determination and resilience, but the artificial enhancements of biomedicine. I believe there's little that is persuasive in this view. Even with enhancements, athletic achievement would require the kind of effort, skill, and training that is already the mark of great athletes, even those whose abilities and phenotype place them at the far extreme of the spectrum of human variation. Shifting that spectrum would scarcely reduce the need to develop whatever given is an athlete's starting point. And of course, we tinker with nature all the time. Indeed, when it comes to protecting ourselves against the forces of nature that damage and harm us, it is urgent that we do so. Modern medicine and public health, for example, are designed to modify the vagaries of nature that threaten our well-being. In short, the good and the natural are different categories and do not necessarily overlap. We know much in nature to be bad, and much that we value in modern medicine, for example, is far from natural. Contemporary evolutionary biology reinforces this view. We are a product of adaptation, of reproductive fitness to our environment. And it is clear that not all of the traits we have acquired by natural selection are good ones. Our ability to reason is deeply flawed. Our capacity for aggression and xenophobia are notorious. Our arteries harden. Our eyes weaken. Our teeth decay. And our bodies succumb to disease and are all too easily injured. Our bipedal stance leads to hernias, backaches, and difficult childbirth. It only matters to Mother Nature that we survive long enough to produce children who themselves are likely to have as many defects. But it matters to us more. No moral objection follows, as far as I can see, to efforts to remedy our defects and to strengthen our better natures. So too for sports. Efforts to yoke sports to a concept of the natural has produced the very degrading morass of sex differentiation that has plagued Olympic officials for so many years. We know enough, too, of efforts to discriminate among athletes based on race to be wary of any recourse to what is deemed natural. So let me return to the criticism that enhancements that only achieve a positional or competitive advantage are immoral. Usually this position is based on the fatuous, though true, claim that such efforts are frequently against current rules. What is not noted is that it is precisely the rules themselves that are in question. More often, it is noted that such efforts are potentially futile, as I've indicated. If everyone tried the same things, no one could achieve a positional advantage. But this is not what the enhancement debate is about. Rather, it is with what some have called general purpose enhancements that would be of value even if, especially if everyone had them. And as I mentioned, increased cognitive abilities, more powerful immune systems and memories, longer, healthier lives, and greater propensities to social cooperativeness. It is true that an unequal distribution of such enhancements would also create positional advantages and so raise serious questions of distributive justice. But if widely available, they would tend to create broader social benefits of productivity and creativity. There is nothing, as far as I can see, that morally privileges the normal, which already includes an unequal distribution of traits as a result of the natural lottery of life. It is largely the individuals who transcend what Norman Daniels has called species-typical functioning that fill the ranks of elite sports. There are nevertheless real dangers of the enhancement projects. And the problem is that not all change is benign. I want to consider some of the dangers inherent in these new technologies. For the most part, the back door to enhancement research lies in the development of the treatment of disease and illness. Although they are fallible and liable to the same pressures for fame and fortune as many medical enterprises, risk assessment protocols and therapeutic medicine offer a framework for discussion of the risks of biomedical enhancement. The problems I will consider here are in regard to the means, not the ends, of the enhancement project. I will return to a renewed consideration of how these ends will transform sports. The risks of clinical research. Clinical research is the opening for enhancement medicine, since many of the frontline procedures, such as drug development to correct metabolic deficiencies and gene modification for serious diseases, are likely to provide the techniques for both drug-based and genetic enhancement in sports. Unfortunately, the ethics of clinical research are far from straightforward. To show this, I want to consider briefly some of the categories of subjects that present the main ethical problems for clinical research. Our ethical precautions about their care can provide the matrix for the ethic of enhancement efforts in sports. Almost all current medicine is directed toward treatment of people suffering from injury and disease. But what is learned in doing so is clearly a step toward enhancement medicine. In addition to adults, two other groups of subjects for this research are especially important: children and prenatal embryos and fetuses. A further category is research on germline cells, that is, sperm and eggs. My main concern is with the protections afforded to subjects of such research and what risks may be warranted in the light of reasonable expectations of benefits. If we can proceed with such research with reasonable precaution, the effects on sports may be significant. The central problem for clinical research is determining when it is permissible to subject people to risky research for the benefit of others, either other people in the future or the researchers themselves. The traditional solution to this problem is that subjects must give fully informed consent. This classic principle of autonomy faces the daunting task of overcoming much skepticism about the level of informed consent most subjects, and athletes in particular, are capable of achieving, and so understanding the risks of pain and injury that they may face. We currently, if reluctantly, allow subjects to participate from a variety of motives, including, for example, giving something back to society. And of course, perhaps the strongest motive of all for those already desperately ill, the great likelihood of death, if nothing at all is done. The empirical problem is getting a good grasp of what the risks and benefits are so that people may judge what participation may on balance be a reasonable choice. But let's suppose for a minute that we can cope with these problems. We redouble our efforts to inform potential subjects, eliminating those who appear not to grasp the basic strategies of the research, particularly the risks of random assignment of test procedures and its implication for their own conditions. And we allow that healthy subjects may sometimes grasp the potential harm they face and nevertheless accept it for altruistic or other reasons. We monitor research protocols through independent review agencies for types of research that are deemed morally impermissible. And we put into place strong regulations against using easily exploited subjects, regulations that protect the poor, the needy, the sick, uneducated, and deluded. If we are reasonably confident that we can allow research on adults, therefore, we can now turn to our concern for children. Much of the dream of enhancement has to do with changes in our abilities to cope with and improve our interactions with the natural world and other people. And these changes are often conceived as beginning with modification of embryos, fetuses, and children. Here, too, there are standards of care and limits on permissible research that are useful guidelines. Clearly, the requirements of informed consent that we saw were problematic, even for adult volunteers, now devolve onto surrogate or parental consent for children. There have been both successes and serious failures in gene therapy. Further research on gene replacement is advancing rapidly, and it is likely soon to become widely available. Whether and how these techniques may affect athletic performance is not clear. The central challenge, however, is not likely to be their use for positional advantage, but their ability to enhance general purpose capacities for children who will subsequently embark upon athletic careers. In the United States, federal regulations on human experimentation are codified by what is called the Common Rule, based on a 1979 report, the so-called Belmont Report, by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. It has been adopted by 15 federal offices and agencies. The National Academy of Sciences also has extensive protocols on risk and benefits in research on children that mirror, to some extent, those for adults. None of these regulations explicitly refers to enhancement experiments, but they do not forbid them either. Finally, we come to the heart of the matter, germline research. What changes to human germlines or gametes can be justified? It is these changes that would affect the general population, that portend the most likely changes in athletic prowess in the near future, and so will most dramatically affect sports. So far, as I've suggested earlier, these developments are mostly in the realm of science fiction, but the prospects of biomedical research in this direction are robust. If genes can be inserted into somatic cells, they can. They can be inserted into germ cells. If we can tinker with bacteria and plants, we do. We can surely graduate soon to primates. Indeed, some fantasize about creating entire new chromosomes that will carry genes to power many enhancements of human capabilities. Once again, a number of arguments come into play against this approach. It is against nature. It threatens human nature. It will commodify us for the sake of research. It will threaten our ability to live authentic and humble lives. It will threaten to create a new species of superior post-human beings who may not care about the current sort of people like us. I do not have time to consider all of these concerns, and though these concerns are plausible, my sympathies are with those who reject these dire projections. But in light of my emphasis on the risks of harm, what harm in the short term can come from biomedical germline research of this sort? If we could produce individuals with more powerful immune systems, greater memories, more robust cognitive abilities, greater capacities for empathy and social cooperation, and stronger physical systems, who could object? But along the way to this self-controlled evolution, we are likely to make many mistakes. So one standard of precaution in this regard may be to consider acceptable risks as those equivalent to the risks of daily life, or the risk of defects in normal births. If on the basis of animal studies and simulations, we could have a reasonable expectation that efforts to produce enhanced individuals were no more risky than normal births, our research might be deemed acceptable, especially if we were persuaded that the likely benefits were very great, just as we are with some of the risks of daily life. But this standard may set the bar too low, especially if we do not know how to provide for our mistakes after they have been born. But even if we accept a high level of risk, it needs to be offset by probable benefits. And what are these? Are there any positive reasons to seek enhancements that outweigh the likely risks? Perhaps we're obligated to implement enhancements, if possible, to help ensure human survival in the face of global warming and social conflict, or to increase our inventiveness and creativity to cope with other problems. We may be no more able to afford not to seek enhancements than we can afford not to educate or to pursue technological innovations. But we must beware not to be driven by some vision of human progress that runs roughshod over the misery of those who will be harmed along the way. So suppose we begin cautiously. We start by enhancing some particular trait, if we can do so safely, perhaps only to the level equivalent to the highest normal variation of that trait. Then we could move on to enhancements beyond the current maximum level of some traits, such as memory or the cognitive abilities, immune responses, empathic range. For more extensive enhancements, a number of cautionary heuristics have been proposed to limit harm. These include, for example, targeting genes that function at the end of ontogenetic development, not ones activated early in embryonic development. Intervening in ways that are limited to single individuals. Intervening in ways that are reversible and that entail no major morphological changes. The basic issue is to protect children and athletes from harm. So here again, we must ask if the risk of harm is commensurate with the likely benefits that the genetic changes may engender. How much freedom, for example, should parents have to decide what risks and benefits are acceptable to their children? What do parents owe their children? United States law and tradition allow a great deal of freedom for parents to choose how their children will be treated. As part of a larger right to reproductive freedom, this control has been acknowledged, for example in Roe v. Wade, to be extensive. But it is not without limits. Drawing on legal precedents and a long tradition of reproductive freedom, Maxwell Mellman, an attorney and bioethicist at Case Western Reserve University, notes that, quote, legally parents can do anything they want to their children, so long as their actions do not amount to abuse or neglect, close quote. He has proposed a general rule for governing biomedical efforts to effect germline enhancement. And here's his rule, quote, parents should be allowed to genetically engineer a future child, except in ways that no reasonable parent would choose or that would expose the child to a substantial risk of serious bodily or mental harm or impairment that is not outweighed by the potential benefit to the child, close quote. But how could such a rule be enforced? A variety of suggestions have flooded the literature. European countries have created state regulatory agencies and laws controlling various kinds of research. In the United States, in addition to guidelines such as those of the National Academy of Science and federal agencies such as the FDA, the Belmont Report, which I mentioned, is the controlling policy. These guidelines are regularly applied, if not always assiduously, by institutional review boards that are federally mandated for all human subjects research. Ronald Green, a Dartmouth bioethicist, has suggested oversight by IRBs and regulatory agencies like the Recombinant DNA Advisory Committee, established by the NIH in 1974. Their rules were revised in 2007. And Alan Buchanan has proposed a global institute for justice and innovation, both to regulate biomedical enhancement projects and to ensure that the results are fairly distributed throughout the world's populations. And so on to the future of sports. Clearly, we are groping in the dark here, seeking both to foster biomedical research and to prevent the worst abuses we fear from it, harms to research subjects, unjust distribution of its risks to the poor and vulnerable, and of its benefits to the rich and powerful. Clinical research on biomedical enhancements, under some of the conditions I have discussed, is nevertheless, in my judgment, morally permissible and should continue. Research that is motivated by individual and family interests, corporate profit, government programs, and professional ambition is likely to go forward at a faster pace, in spite of serious ethical deficiencies of inadequate consent, exploitation of subjects, and harm to individuals. But barring major catastrophes of various kinds, enhancement projects have the potential to transform human lives for the better. Not soon, perhaps, but it will come. And in the end, it may be those enhancements that are our best bet to ward off catastrophe. And it is those enhancements that will have the major impact on athletic performance and sport. But why not be satisfied with who and what we are? To accept our lot is clearly the message of the conservative critics of biomedical research and of those who fear changes in sports. One answer is that it is too late. And in any case, the research is scarcely distinguishable as a part of our long history of medicine in improving human lives. Another answer is that in spite of the evidence of our reproductive success in populating the globe and eliminating most of our competition, or perhaps because of it, we are a fragile species. Our best hope of continued survival may lie, ironically, in the evolutionary imperative of change. Perhaps even change that renders our descendants quite different from us, but change that we cannot wait for nature to engineer. We must seek to make those changes ourselves so far as we can and consistent with our moral and ethical precepts. The great struggle will be to ensure that these changes, like other new technologies, are fairly distributed to everyone and not limited to the rich and powerful. Likely our students today, and certainly their children, will know how it turns out. What place there might be for Homo sapiens in the long term is the subject of much speculation. So far, such speculation largely belongs, as I indicated, to the realm of science fiction. But more modest changes are already available to us and will probably be a significant factor in the lives of you and your children, certainly my grandchildren. What will these changes in the availability of enhancement technologies do for the microcosm of sports, embedded as it is in the larger society where these changes will likely flourish? After World War II, the development of concern for drugs in sports was strongly boosted by Cold War politics and the use of international sports competition to further the ideological agendas of democratic and communist regimes. Anti-doping policies were shaped by the war on recreational drug use and its clandestine economic base by the United States government. Following actions by the United States Congress in 1988 and in later legislation to criminalize the non-medical distribution and possession of steroids and human growth hormone, the war against doping in sports and the government's war on drugs merged. The police power of the state and the regulatory function of the United States Anti-Doping Agency, most of whose budget is funded by Congress, were partially combined. This merger raises sobering concerns not only for the autonomy of physicians in contemporary medicine to practice, but for citizen autonomy as well. Nevertheless, as we have seen, it's not likely that restrictions on enhancement technologies that arise out of medical research will foreclose their use by many people, though safeguards are clearly needed. There's even reason to believe that governments will find a compelling interest in allowing them to flourish. But limitations in sports is another matter. Regulation of enhancement techniques in sports, primarily at the present time of drug use, is largely voluntary. Its support by Congress and international sports organizations notwithstanding. Because it is highly selective, it is also largely arbitrary. Sports organizations and national regulatory bodies, such as the United States Anti-Doping Agency, can continue to control the conditions under which participants can play in the future. And of course, schools and universities will no doubt both follow professional sports organizations and attend to their special concerns with juvenile athletes. In short, whatever happens in the larger society, sports could, for a time, remain enclaves free of certain kinds of biomedical enhancement influences. But if enhancement technologies proceed to develop at their current rate and their use proliferates, then the larger society will change and bring a variety of pressures on sports to do so as well. I will not speculate on bionic athletes, whatever these might be, or cyborg games, though I can imagine them. But I believe we have some basis for speculating on the gradual changes in sports that a change in our larger society would entail. Our sports have already changed over the years as various enhancement techniques have become available. New equipment and facilities, better coaching techniques, biomedical and psychological assistance in training and practicing, nutrition counseling, and the greater health and resources of the general population. But perhaps more important for some sports has been the active seeking and recruiting of potential athletes whose natural abilities and phenotypes place them at one extreme of human genetic variability. Variations in VO2 max, types of muscle fibers, hematocrit levels, height, visual acuity, and coordination vary widely and can be identified as positional advantages for athletic competition. Several national sports organizations actively seek recruits for Olympic Games from among those with ideal phenotypes for particular sports. The selections have produced profound changes in the sports themselves and effectively made the playing fields uneven for many people. A number of tactics are therefore open to sports organizations faced with the general population that embraces the enhancement technologies of drugs and genetic engineering. First is the old standby of divide and conquer. Just as participants are segregated now by sex and size and sometimes by age and disability, though fortunately no longer by race, they could also be segregated into those who are the product of biomedical enhancements and those who are not. The vast enforcement regime now being used by the anti-doping agencies would be needed to mark the boundaries between the two. But many enhancements are not ones chosen by the athletes, but rather chosen by their parents or grandparents. So like those with natural genetic variations or mutations, the athletes cannot be designated as rule breakers and outlaws. Sports organizations will need to justify their exclusions from team rosters or simply set arbitrary cutoffs on certain genetic or physical traits for participants, as is now done for hematocrit level or testosterone as a way of checking for the use of EPO and for sexual traits. They will need to offer cogent defenses of such approaches to meet objections of arbitrary bias and exclusion. Fearful of the changes that challenge such segregation, sports organizations can follow the usual last-ditch stand. They can appeal to the spirit of sport. The World Anti-Doping Agency's appeal to this spirit is, quote, the celebration of natural talents and their virtuous perfection. This falls prey to several objections. Once again, it appeals to a limited and normative concept of the natural. It cannot easily account for those whose inherited abilities are the product of the choices of early generations rather than their own. It has little to offer in clarifying the policies dealing with genetic variation that already advantages many athletes and disadvantages those deemed to be deviant from current norms. It seems further to have a limited view of sport as characterized by competitive and hierarchical rankings, thus ruling out ice climbing, hang gliding, sailing, hunting, and many other forms of sporting activity. It falters in its prescriptive recommendation on a covert appeal to the essence of sport. A more likely scenario is that sports will gradually change, embracing new ranges of ability, and perhaps the welcome result that more and more people will have the capacity for competing at a high level, no longer being limited by the vagaries of the lottery of life. Thank you.
Thanks for a very thoughtful paper note. So we're open for questions. In the back.
Genetically enhanced or not?
Are there any existing technologies that you do agree with using right now?
Oh, sure. I agree with, yeah, sure, there are lots of them.
Like such as, are you for HGH use or any other kind of enhancement?
Well, of course, that's being used by endocrinologists for all sorts of reasons, and
In sports.
it's used illicitly in sports now. Yeah, I'm in favor of reviewing the rules which prevent it. Absolutely. But the genetic procedures that are currently used are very widespread. There was a piece last week in the New York Times on the genetic transformation of T cells in a young girl who suffered from a form of lymphoma. They inserted a new gene in her immune cells. The T cells are one form of the cells in the immune system, using a viral vector, which is a virus which has been rendered less virulent than normal. And since the virus attacks cells, they can use the virus as a kind of technical, surgical technique for inserting a new gene in the cells of the individual they're treating. Her cells were successfully modified. Her T cells then went on to attack the aberrant cells in her system produced by the lymphoma. The only result was they also attacked some of her other immune cells. So there was a serious side effect. Fortunately, there were techniques available for controlling that side effect, and she survived. There are other cases, the most notorious cases of a young man named Jesse Gelsinger who went to the University of Pennsylvania to be treated for similar kinds of things. He wasn't at the risk of dying as this other young girl was, but he volunteered to be a subject for a similar sort of procedure. The researchers who were in cahoots with pharmaceutical companies and the local bioethicists neglected to tell him that there were potential serious side effects of the viral infection. It turns out he was allergic to those particular viruses, and he died. His family sued the University of Pennsylvania and successfully closed down the operation. So there's some very serious risk about it, and that's why I spent some time trying to decide, I said, how do we prevent that kind of reckless use of these technologies? And there's no guarantee that we can, particularly in other countries, but in this country we can certainly begin to do so by various procedures of controlled experimentation.
If we could direct that directly to sport, though, and positional goods rather than all-purpose and the like, is there an argument to be made that we all end up at the same place, and perhaps a futility argument? Just looking at the positional goods standpoint, and so why go down this route? Why not take a more conservative approach?
Well, I think a lot of things that are being considered for enhancement can produce positional advantages if they're not widely spread, widely available. If they are widely available, they're still good things to have. So if we could change your memory, let's say, so that you have a better memory, then you could excel in school, perhaps. Right? But if everybody could do that, wouldn't that also be good? So Southern California would have a great student body.
I can see someone making an argument, though, it wouldn't necessarily be good if we end up in the same place that we began. Why take those?
Well, as I say, sure.
Advocate.
But that means that people who participate, there'll be more and more people who have the capacity to participate in elite sports. The elite sports themselves will then be confronted with ability ranges that are no longer sensible within the rules of the games as we now have them. So the games will be changed. People start changing the rules to increase the competitive interest in the game. More and more people will be able to compete at a high level of performance. And I just don't think they'll remain static. I mean, I don't have any clear answer. In the last 40, 50 years, the average height of professional basketball players has gone up about 4 or 5 inches. The average height. And the average weight about 25 pounds. Well, there's been a lot of talk about it. Should we change the game? Should we change the height of the goal? Should we change the dimensions of the court and so forth?
It's like a javelin throw. They can throw it so far now, they just change the aerodynamics.
Sure. So that's going to happen to our sports, I think. I don't know how.
Right here.
So would you
Nice and loud.
What's your ideal outcome, you think, for regulation?
I'm sorry?
Can't hear you.
What do you think your ideal outcome is for regulation?
Well, what I use the word break. My ideal is to slow down this process. I think this is my own sort of personal take on technological change in general, and I think it's moving at such an extraordinary rate that we're rapidly losing our ability both to understand its effects on our society and ourselves and to control it in a reasonable way. So I would hope that also in the case of biomedical research that it's also advancing astonishingly rapidly, that we could use these institutions for protecting subjects of the research. You're going to have to try this stuff out on somebody, and to place regulations on the use of the research, which will force them to be far more cautious in the development of their projects. So my ideal would be slow it down until we can understand better what its possible results are and what the benefits are actually going to be.
Question right
But
here.
I'm in favor of going ahead with it, not simply closing it down.
Yes.
Well,
Nice.
the Ultimate Fighting Championship recently placed a ban on all forms of enhancements. And I was just wondering what your opinion is on the use of TRT with athletes who are testosterone deficient.
What's TRT?
It's a testosterone replacement therapy.
Oh,
Because they recently banned that, but that means that even athletes who are testosterone deficient aren't allowed to take it to just even out.
yeah, I think that's bad. I mean, the question of the empirical evidence is not clear that testosterone alone is going to make much of a difference to anybody. It's the same with this Duty Chand, this young woman from India who was banned from the Commonwealth Games, she's a sprinter, because her testosterone level exceeds that of the lower range of male athletes in comparable sports. And so my understanding is the Commonwealth Game officials said she couldn't compete, and she would continue to be prevented from competing unless she used chemical or surgical means for reducing her testosterone output. She told them. And she hasn't done it, to her credit. But I think that's one of the problems that will increasingly emerge as more and more people are willing to admit and show variations in their capabilities. And how are you
Right
going
here,
to exclude
then we'll
them?
get back to you.
Do you think enhancements will make contact sports more dangerous?
It could, absolutely. I mean, but that's already happened. And that's what I think the wonderful discussions that we had the last couple of days have indicated, that there's some serious problems with particularly contact sports and the injuries and harm that they produce. But what's happening is we're recruiting bigger and stronger and tougher and more brutal players. And so, of course, it's going to produce much more harm. I'm not in favor of that. But the question is whether that's, I don't think that the research that's developing and the use of these technologies is going to be directed in that way. I don't think it'd be allowed by the research regulatory organizations, and but we can already do it.
But in sports, we don't really seem to have that regulatory oversight at all. In the back.
I was just wondering if you think sometime in our near future there's going to be a popular sport that encourages the use of PEDs for entertainment's sake?
The use of what?
We
I can't hear you.
Is there going to be a sport that encourages the use of PEDs for entertainment's sake?
PEDs for entertainment? Sport
Like
for entertainment?
performance-enhancing drugs for entertainment's sake. So a football league with a bunch
You don't think that happens now?
Yeah.
I don't think they encourage it.
Encourages it? You don't think that happens now?
No, I do not.
So,
I'm inclined to think that it's endemic to
back in the days when I was a
professional
graduate
sports.
student, I went straight from being a Roman Catholic to a Minnesota Vikings fan, and I'm not at any more at peace as a result. But they lost 4 times. That was a bad joke, I guess. But they lost 4 times the Super Bowl. The starting center for the Minnesota Vikings, Mick Tingelhoff. This is in the 70s. What would you guess his weight was? 230 pounds.
Another
I rest my
joke.
case. What's going on? I mean, I don't think the advent of the 300-pound lineman is an evolutionary change. I don't think so. So the idea then is that it's already happening, implicitly or explicitly.
And to a considerable extent for entertainment purposes.
Yeah.
We make money for the owners of the teams, certainly in professional sports. But So I don't think the enhancement project is designed to do anything with that. I mean, I don't think researchers and others who are developing these genetic procedures care much about that kind of thing.
So Miller, we got a question from Professor Lowland here.
Ah.
He's in the Anti-Doping Association Review Board.
I know, but he's also interested in these topics.
Yeah. Be careful.
Please.
I enjoy this very much. Of course, another way of dealing with the last comments now with increased weight, increased height is classification.
Is what? I'm sorry?
Classification.
Yes.
You don't need genetic intervention in basketball. You can classify.
Sure.
Say above or beyond the 6 feet.
Sure. Absolutely. That's I'm.
Open up for participation.
Yeah.
But my question was more linked to the your general enhancement argument. I definitely follow.
That's good.
Why is genetic inequality in sport a big problem? It's not a human right to become an elite sport athlete, to become an Olympic gold medal winner. And we tend to admire natural talent. Great performance is a combination. Some have great natural talents. They train moderately. They still perform. Others have moderate talent. They train very hard. They perform. It's a mix of a genetic gift and then hard training and skill. And what's the problem? Why should we equalize genetic inequality in sport?
Yeah, I don't think we should necessarily, and I don't think that's the goal of the enhancement project. I think what the enhancement project wants to do is to develop the range of abilities and capacities in the population as a whole. And that will have, as a secondary effect, profound influences on sports. So even if, but as far as, I mean, it's a little bit like, looking to admit good students at a university like this. Why should we, why shouldn't we treat every student within the range of his or her abilities and do the best we can to educate them? We should, definitely. But we should also seek to go out and find those students whose potential is also very great and provide them opportunities for education. And we should try to enhance their preparation and development so that they would have a better chance of getting into a first-rate university and so forth. And I think that's the general move here, is to increase the range of human response to environment, to the circumstances of global life. And I think just like, for example, increasing the level of health in the world. If we did that, made populations in various parts of the world greater, people would live longer, they'd be more successful, their level of intelligence would be greater because they didn't have dietary deficiencies as children and so forth. And presumably that would enhance, we would hope, the ability of peoples around the world to, provide for themselves, to be more creative and developmental and so forth. And I think that's what people are trying to do. And if they do that, then it's going to it will tear apart these classifications within sports but I think that's the first line of defense. I think you're absolutely right, and a useful one. Although I think in the case of my sex differentiation, it has terrible consequences for young women like Dutri Chand and others. And the frequency, my old friend David Suzuki once estimated that the frequency of these sexual variations in the X and Y chromosomes is 1 in 500. That means there are a huge number of people who, if examined genetically, would be disqualified from participating in our sports, which are rigidly classified as male and female. I don't think that's good. I think it's unjust.
So those of us who've lost the genetic lottery have a different answer to that question. I mean, why do you deserve to have, just speaking personally. For those of us with lack of talent, we have an issue with desert. Why do you deserve to have those natural inequalities? In other words, it was the spin of the genetic lottery. You won, I lost. How fair is that? I mean, that's a little bit biased, but it's an objection I commonly think about in most every field, that I lack talent.
Well, I think I made that point. I mean, this will increase a point I made at our panel discussion. That it's a question of who gets included in the activities that, sports activities that we have, and if we could, increase the abilities of people to participate, that would be wonderful. Why not?
Well, I would totally agree on the level of participation. Then it's on the level. On the level of participation, it's a good thing. And if the argument is with general enhancement in the population, this will have implications for classification and and participation in sport, I'm all with you. I understand you're more skeptical to the specific use of, let's say, gene therapy techniques to develop a particular trait of relevance only in one particular sport. That's a different issue.
Yeah, I think it is, and I don't think it's going to happen. I think this is a fantasy of people who are fearful of genetic change, and I think some of the regulatory systems that we have in place will prevent that from happening.
Yeah, then we agree.
Yes, John.
So, but now I'm worried because it looks like you may be committing the same sort of concern. You expressed concern about the justifiability of the rules, but now the question is, well, if we could make elite athletes, if we could level the playing fields for them by specific enhancements, and my guess is probably through somatic cell therapies and so on, we will be able to make them bigger muscles or quicker twitch muscles and so on that will give them special advantages. And
Louder, John.
the techniques will be.
Yeah, well, you can do that already.
Yeah. No, but I know. So then the question is, well, why doesn't the same critique? Why are you so concerned then? We're not so concerned. Why don't you use the same arguments to object to that type of?
I would. I absolutely would.
Yeah. Okay.
I mean, this is scary stuff. To be frank, I'm scared about this. I don't know what impact this will have on my grandchildren. And this is true not only for genetic kind of stuff, whether somatic or germline, but it's true for the availability of other very powerful ways of enhancing our behavior. It's dangerous stuff. I wouldn't touch it.
But if it could be made safe.
If it's made safe, then you've got a whole new thing to consider. Okay, so now it can be safe, and so you have people that, lots of berry bonds and so forth, and it's safe, and what are you going to do? And you can segregate. You can say that people who have been enhanced that way play one league, and those, but we've been that way, and it, if you're black, you play in one league. If you're white, you play in another. If you're female, you play in one. If you're male, you play in another. If you're disabled, you play in one. If you're abled, you play in another. I mean, if we go on with this, forever, we're going to run up against changes in the population, increase in the level of health, increase in the level of physical ability, increase in the variety of other traits that will impact on the ability to perform in sports. And that segregation is not going to be successful for very long. But I think it's the first line of defense.
Any other questions? Yes, please.
You mentioned, or you addressed that many students use Ritalin or Adderall to enhance their academic performance.
Yep.
But most of the students that use that are often prescribed, but for the ones that are not, that is an illegal substance and it is giving them an unfair advantage. Do you consider that cheating or not?
Well, what's unfair?
That not everyone has access to it because it's supposed to be a prescribed substance.
So give them access. I mean, it works.
So the problem.
We want our students to do well. If that could enhance your learning and preparation and your success in college, and it's safe,
So the problem's the rule.
what's not to like? Bill and I used to, in the early days of considering this kind of issue, we used to come at our lectures when we debated about PEDs, and we'd bring a large cup of coffee. And I remember one talk, I brought in a large cup of coffee and I set it on the podium, and there were lots of faculty members out there, and I said, how many of you faculty members have a couple of cups of strong coffee before your 8:30 class? And all the hands went up. So now we can talk. It's clearly an enhancement beverage. It's that caffeine which makes them lively in the morning. Now, should we ban that?
No.
Well, all right, so what's wrong with it?
Well, my question was, everyone can have access to coffee. It's not
Yeah.
illegal.
Well, why is it illegal? There you go.
You mentioned sometimes that it's if it's widely available, if it's evenly distributed, sort of from a theoretical approach to
Yeah.
this project. But then you also touch on human nature and our flawed ability to reason, and the fact that we've got an unequal distribution of wealth
Yeah.
and resources as it is.
Yeah.
Does that in any way affect your argument?
Yes, yes. That's the most embarrassing question you can ask. Absolutely. the question of distributive justice is really key to all of this, and it comes out with legalizing drugs and the availability of stuff. It's the
How would you sort of prescribe a remedy for that?
I don't know. I don't know if it's ever going to be possible. It's a problem we face in our own society with the distribution of advantages of various kinds. Not everybody can go to a very fancy preparatory school and get a fantastic secondary education and get admitted to Harvard or University of Southern California, whatever but not everybody can do that. Why not? Because the distribution of that wealth and privilege is not very wide. So there are problems of distributive justice at every level of our society for all kinds of technologies, for healthcare, and it will certainly plague this enhancement project if it gets underway. And I think it's going to be especially true with third world countries and elsewhere where the distribution of these, just like the distribution of powerful and effective medical resources, is very difficult to effect. I don't know the answer to that. As I said, Alan Buchanan has proposed a kind of United Nations agency for overseeing the distribution of the technologies and the knowledge of how to do these things worldwide as a way of confronting that problem of distributive justice. But look, it's not a new one. And I suppose the question would arise in the development of any new technology. Should we not do it because not everybody will benefit? Or should we simply work even harder to see that the distribution of these beneficial technologies and so forth is widespread? And I guess I opt for the latter. In that sense, I'm maybe a foolish optimist, but I think that's the way we have to go. We have to do a lot better. But it's the deepest problem of maybe of our society at all levels, but certainly for this enhancement project. Really great question.
You may answer this question exactly the same way, but who is to decide whether a particular treatment is healthy or safe, and whether we should all be compelled to adopt it in order to survive?
Well, this I take it is the underlying sentiment of the conservative critics like Michael Sandel, who's a gifted Harvard philosopher and political theorist. He teaches a course on justice, which 500 Harvard students go to every year. I think what he's worried about, what other conservative critics are worried about, is something like this, that there are natural processes in the development of human life. It starts at conception, it goes through gestation, and even further into development as adults. These natural processes offer a kind of guide for how we ought to reflect on our development of medicine, our education, our various kinds of helpful things. And you can put it as a kind of principle, like any natural process which has important influences in the structural features of our lives are prima facie, it's prima facie immoral to disrupt them. So, for example, there are natural processes connected with gestation and conception and gestation, which makes a conservative argument against abortion, because it interrupts a natural process which is fundamentally responsible for the structuring and organization of the lives of human beings. And you can see that same sort of concern arising in the case of bioengineering and these other technologies. What they're worried about is exactly what you're asking. How do we know which changes to make? How do we know which direction to go? How do we know what is valuable and not valuable in directing human evolution? And their view is that the natural order of things gives us a guideline which has a kind of normative or prescriptive punch to it. So the conservative tack is don't change, follow nature, it shows us what's best. The liberal view, on the other hand, is that we can identify a variety of features of human life which we don't like. And I mentioned a bunch of them. I don't like the arthritis developing. It hurts. I don't want that. I don't like the fact that I have to use reading glasses now to see. I don't like to know that my 10K time is about double what it was when I was your age. What can I do about it? Now, if I don't like that, why can't I seek to remedy that? And other traits, other weaknesses, other features of the natural selection, which has left us humans not particularly, masters of the universe. Yes, we can look at the guidelines of natural processes of development, but we can also look at our needs and interests and hopes and expectations and use the moral sensibility that we've developed over many years to guide in the direction that we want to have this research go. I think we may make mistakes. I don't think we will obviously easily come to agreement on them, but there are a number of ways which you could start. Enhance our immune system. Suppose I could offer you guys a way of genetically changing your gametes, sperm and ova, so that your children would be automatically immune, their immune systems would be so strong that they would be immune to Ebola and other exotic viral diseases. Would you do it? Or would you say, no, that's unnatural. I don't want to tinker with my gametes?
Well, to be clear, I'm not making an argument
I know,
that you should never tinker.
No.
I'm saying, how do we decide whether the benefit is worth the risk? And if one's individual decision is starkly different from the herd's decision, is that fair to the individual? If the herd decides that we should all take Adderall because that will boost our performance and that the side effect that it has to our well-being is worth it, or if a select subset of professional athletes decides they are willing to die in order to enhance their performance to a certain level, should I, as a university student, or I, as a professional athlete, be compelled to keep up with the far end of the spectrum?
Compelled to keep up?
Would I not be compelled, if I wanted to be a professional athlete, to also...
Well, look what you're compelled to do already if you want to be a professional athlete. That's not going to change anything. I mean, look at the life that what's his name, Michael, the swimmer, Michael Phelps. Look at the life he led before he won all those medals. It was an incredibly impoverished life. He didn't do anything for years. But he had sacrificed to do that. Nobody compelled him to do it. So I don't see those kinds of choices as being... I thought your question was rather, given that those choices are going to be made and that you have the ability to make a lot of them, what choices can we have any reasonable assurance are the right ones? How do we know we're going to screw this up? And we don't know for sure. So I just gave you an example. Suppose I could enhance the immune systems, not of you, it's too late, but of your children. Now, is that a hard one? I don't find it hard, but maybe you guys do. And you say, well, I don't know, I don't want you tinkering with my gametes. What are the risks? I say, no risks. We've tried this on animals, works perfectly. Tried it on primates, no harm to them.
One more quick question, and then we must end.
Well, just taking aspects from the previous question, I was just wondering, at what point do these enhancements differentiate from being a purpose to remedy to abuse?
I'm not quite sure I understand what you mean by abuse.
Like at what?
I mean, by remedy, I assume you mean using these technologies for treatment of medical conditions, for example. And
exactly, like arthritis.
A lot of people have tried to argue that the difference between treatment and enhancement is quite clearly rigid, and that they want to restrict these technologies to areas of treatment and not allow them in cases of enhancement, because they argue that treatments simply restore certain forms of health and ability, whereas enhancements go beyond that and do something else greater. My arguments about this, which I left out of the paper, are that the distinction between enhancements and treatments are really quite blurred, and that we do lots of enhancement stuff now. Vaccines, fluorination of drinking water, well baby care, annual checkups. These are all designed not simply to treat diseases, but to enhance your ability to cope with the dangers of your life. So I don't think that can be made as a rigid distinction.
We have to end now. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.